Hi, and now we're going to look at Chapter 10, Gendered Organizational Communication. Now, in this particular chapter, we're going to be looking at, for the most part, the organizational communication structure. And we're going to look at sort of the stereotypes, both for female and males. And then we're also going to touch base on some of the policies and procedures that follow somewhat the formal processes, and as well as the informal. Now, as you've probably already noticed with the textbook, it's particularly focused on American legislations and policies and procedures. Now, I have included a little bit of Canadian content that's not in your textbook, but I just wanted you to be familiar with that. Now, at the end of this particular video, we're going to touch base on some of the strategies that are being used to sort of overcome some of these inequities that exist in organizations. Now, these will be out of the textbook. I'm going to maintain that because that's what you'll have to study from. And so it's looking at American-based ones, okay? So let's get started with this, and then let's get started with the gendered stereotypes in the workplace. Now, social expectations of sexes, they influence how we treat people in professional contexts. Stereotypes of women. When we start with that, women in the workplace are often stereotyped into one of four categories. Now, these are generalized categories. It's not to say that everybody gets treated in one of these four. It's not that black and white. However, it is something that lets us know, and we'll see this in terms of how men are stereotyped, that these are generalized categories that often women can get categorized in that influence how they're treated and what's expected of them. Okay, so let's review them. Number one, and this isn't in order of anything else other than the way they're listed in your textbook, sex object. Now this stereotype, the sex object stereotype, defines define a woman's value based on her sexual attractiveness, where perceiving women based on their appearance rather than their qualifications. Now, in the US and in Canada, federal law prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, race, national origin, age, disability, religion. Now, some qualities are considered bona fide occupational requirements. Now, this stereotyping, it contributes to sexual harassment to women and members of the LGBTQ community. Now, another category is one that's known as the mother category. And the stereotype of women as mother has figurative and literal forms. The figurative version of the expression is when others expect women to take care of everyone, looking out after everyone, making sure everyone's got coffee and donuts. Now, this stereotyping also leads to segregation of female employees into positions providing support and care for others, such as a clerical or service position. Now, the literal form of mother is employees who are also mothers. These women are perceived as less serious. They are less likely to be hired or promoted and offered lower salaries. Now, we're going to come back to that when we look at the glass ceiling and glass walls phenomenon. Now, fatherhood tends to benefit male workers who are seen as more committed to earning an income to support a family. Now, the term maternal wall, it refers to the unexamined assumptions held by coworkers and superiors about how women will behave at work after they become mothers, maybe not as committed. And so that's a stereotype that doesn't apply to all women, certainly. Now, the third category is that what is known as the child category. Now, this stereotype sees women as a child or a pet, cute, but not to be taken seriously. Now, women are assumed to need protection of adults. And so that's the assumption. Now, it's not something that we can say unilaterally. Of course, all women don't need protection. They're strong, independent, and quality workers. And yet the stereotype is that they do, and therefore they're not taken as seriously. Now, often stereotyping women as children is justified as protecting women from harsh realities of the world. One example of this is the obstacles women serving in the law enforcement. But that's not what women expect, nor is it what women are capable of doing. It limits, and that's what these categories do. And we'll see this the same way for men. Now, the last category is what's known as Iron Maiden. Stereotyping women a woman who is ambitious, directive, competitive, and sometimes tough as an Iron Maiden defines a woman with these qualities as competent but unlikable because she's not very feminine. And yet these are the very same qualities that we admire in men, but when they seem to be applied to women, it's not seen as particularly positive. Now, it's a compliment to call a male worker ambitious, but it's not necessarily seen that same way for women in all cases. So let's touch base with stereotypes of men. Now, men in the workplace are often stereotyped in ways that reflect cultural views of masculinity that affect how men are perceived and treated. Now, we're going to start with one that's known as the sturdy oak. Now, the sturdy oak is a self-sufficient pillar of strength. With this view, men may rule out consulting others for advice or assistance. They are a standalone, do-it-yourself, I don't need anybody, I'm self-sufficient, I'm strong. But in the work world, that doesn't necessarily get you further ahead, and it certainly doesn't necessarily make you a more effective team player, which is where a lot of workplaces are going towards, is more cooperation and more team working. So the sturdy oak is an old view of how men were treating, saw themselves, and now trying to still apply it in the current world. A second category is one known as the fighter. Men are supermen, like warriors who go out into battle, either literally or metaphorically. So fighters should be aggressive. They should win at all costs. There's no room to be less than fully committed. And certainly in a workplace, there are places where that might make sense. But there are also examples where men being seen in that manner don't get viewed in a particularly positive light when it comes to teamwork and collaboration. Men who ask for paternal leave can face hostility for not pulling their careers first. So men who see the importance of being a parent, who might want to take parental leave in order to be time with family while their children are newborn, may be viewed as less committed to their careers because of doing that. Men are increasingly resisting this pressure. Now, the third one, it's one you're probably more familiar with, and that is the category of breadwinner. One of the strongest stereotypes of men is that of a breadwinner. And it's the reason that they are often paid more than women. They also, but also why they are expected to put work ahead of family time. Now, this is a stereotype that is coming from a long time ago in the 1950s and earlier, where for the most part men were the workers and women stayed at home. So the breadwinner was the one who worked, brought home the money, and supported the family. But we find that dual incomes in families, dual career in families is more and more common, where the man isn't the breadwinner. So the stereotype of seeing you as a man to be the breadwinner might not be realistic, in that you might not be able to make that kind of money that can support a family in today's world. And so your partner may in fact earn more than you. So what does that do to you if you think that you're supposed to be the breadwinner? And that's the stereotype that's being foisted upon you. Men who tie their identity and their worth to earning power are in danger in a culture where gender roles are evolving, and we are among that kind of environment now. Now, moving into the non-binary genders and organizations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans workers are often met with hostility for challenging gender in the workplace, and they may have fewer legal protections. Performing non-binary gender, like wearing something outside the norm, can risk hostility by colleagues, eligibility for promotion, or the job itself. Now, there's no consistent federal protection for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Now, that comment there is a US-based comment. We have more of those protections in Canada under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So now let's look at narrowing the gender stereotype limit and trying to affect more workers more completely. The masculine norms of a professional life. Work norms. Now, if you're not familiar, norms are is a sociological term that's used to describe the code of conduct. There's norms for sitting in a church listening to a sermon when the minister or the priest finishes their talk. It's a norm to follow the procedures of what your church decorum is, the ethics, the code of conduct, what you're supposed to do. But if you started to do the wave, you might not be well received, because that's not the norm. Rules, laws, expectations about how people are supposed to behave are all norms, and they can vary from province to province, city to city, certainly from country to country. So when we talk about masculine norms in professional life, it suggests that a lot of workplaces and in the professional life follow masculine norms. Because men have historically dominated institutional life from stockyards to factories to corporations, masculine norms in professional life infuse the workplace. And I might point out that you guys out there probably don't notice it, because we are guys. We have been socialized, maybe more gently than others, but we don't notice when it's a male-dominated workforce. But if you're a woman and you see what men can do and find out that you can't do that same thing, not because you're not capable, but because the structure, the professional life isn't designed for women, and therefore there's a treatment that is different, then you start to recognize that there's a masculine professional life. Now, the traditional masculine images of leaders, while the communication skills developed in masculine speech communities, this comes from an earlier chapter, are often associated with management leadership skills. Now, these skills include assertiveness, independence, competitiveness, and confidence. Now, you remember, that was viewed as kind of the Iron Maiden and not really well received. So for women to be in that masculine sort of leadership role, it's difficult to follow those same categories as it is for men. Now, there are some gender differences in how individuals approach work, including leadership. Men tend to find having authority intrinsically rewarding, whereas women are more likely to find it rewarding when coupled with having influence. You don't have to direct, but you need to influence and have others be able to work with you. Now, the feminine communicators should become proficient. Complying with masculine norms is the expectation, and masculine communicators should develop the skills in collaborating and collaborative and support. So there's a need for a crossing over for the feminine communication communities to adopt some masculine, and some of the masculine communication communities to develop some feminine skills. In fact, the most effective leadership styles are those that blend relationship building and instrumental qualities. So now let's look at traditional masculine norms for career paths. So where can you go when you get a job and you're starting at the low run? How far can you go, and where can you go altogether? We tend to think of careers as linear. You start here, you move, and you go linearly, in a line. That we start at an entry position and work our way up the ladder. We also think of them as being full-time jobs. This assumption reflects social relations of previous eras. Now, workers often want organizations to have more flexible schedules and policies to accommodate families and the life choices that are not consistent with full-time. So linear models such as flexible hours and on-site childcare, part-time work, and more flexible overall career paths. Now, recent research shows that women who work outside of the home are as happy and healthy than stay-at-home mothers, and among single mothers, more so. Children of working mothers are often just as advanced academically, emotionally balanced, and socially adjusted as those who stay at home or those who are stay-at-home moms. When mothers who leave paid work to care for children and attempt to return, this is where they can run into some obstacles. So what we'll look at here is some of the gendered patterns in organizations, and we're going to look at formal practices and informal practices. And we'll begin with the formal practices. And then this is where your book sort of goes off onto a U.S. Practice of leave policies. So if you're going to have maternity or paternal leaves. And I'm going to walk you through briefly the medical, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which is the U.S., but I'm also going to touch on the employment insurance for Canada and how it plays out. So let's look at, in the U.S., the Family and Medical Leave Act, that's the FMLA, states that employees can take up to 12 weeks unpaid leave to care for a new baby or a sick family member. Now in 2010, this was extended to workers in the same-sex relationship who needed time to care for a partner's child. However, the FMLA covers only about 60% of the employees in the United States. Some states have enacted more generous family leave laws. Now, since the FMLA does not require that employers pay employees on leave, many workers can't afford to take the leave. So even though only maybe 60% are covered, many of that 60% can't afford to leave. Now, the United States is the only, and this is what, peculiar, if you will. The United States is the only high-income country and one of a very few countries in general that does not provide a guaranteed pay family leave policy. The United States shares this distinction with Oman, Papua New Guinea, and Tonga. So it doesn't speak too highly of what the U.S. is doing for families. Now in Canada, employment insurance maternity benefits can be paid for a maximum period of 15 weeks. Now you cannot receive EI maternity benefits beyond 17 weeks after the expected or actual week of a childbirth, which has about, whichever happens to be which happens of the two tend to be longer or later. Now, EI maternity benefits are payable only to the biological mother who was unable to work because she's pregnant or has recently given birth. To receive maternity benefits, you need to prove your pregnancy by signing a statement declaring that the expected due date and the actual due dates of the birth. Now, there are parental benefits. Employment insurance parental benefits can be paid for a maximum period of 35 weeks. The payments must be made within 52 weeks of the week of the child being born and the week of your child was placed with you for adoption, if that's what you did instead of having your own child you adopted. So now EI parental benefits are payable only to the biological or adoptive parents while they are caring for their newborn or newly adopted child. To receive parental benefits, you must sign a statement declaring the newborn's date of birth, or when there is an adoption, the child's date of placement for the purposes of the adoption, and the name and address of the adoptive authority. So we certainly don't fall into the same path as the U.S., and we're far better among other high-income countries. There is more protection for families. Now, when we think another formal policy is that of work schedules. Rigid work schedules are another reflection of outdated career models. This model doesn't accommodate the two-worker or single-parent family with young children. We see two-career and two-job families increasing quite significantly. Women are more likely than men to take off work in order to provide care for children. Even if both of them are working, that still seems to be the case. Providing more time and flexibility, working hours can actually save employers money by boosting worker productivity, increasing morale, and reducing turnover. And there's research after research that supports that. Now, a nursing home in Sweden reduced work hours without reducing pay and saw an increased productivity. So we see around the world these sorts of issues and innovations are being done on formal practices. All right, so let's look at some of the informal practices. Now, formal practice are written documents, laws, policies. Informal practices would be those things that aren't written but seem to occur. Now, one of the informal practices is what's known as the unwelcoming environment for women. Now, even when used unintentionally, language related to sports, sexuality, and the military may bind men into a masculine community in which women feel unwelcome. Check the examples you'll see in your textbook on this. Now, another component, and you've probably heard this by a different name, the informal network. Now, the informal network is also known as the old boys network. And it's comprised of predominantly male members. They are involved with hiring, promotion decisions, and often made through informal communication with these networks. And they tend to promote and support other men. Now, that is starting to change. We see more and more women that are cracking the glass ceiling and sort of getting into the higher levels by which the old boy network or the informal networks don't maintain the same way. Informal networks are made up of people who see themselves as similar, which can create barriers for co-workers who are not like most of the people in that group. Women, people of color, gender-conforming workers may avoid informal networks and lose out on key sources of information and support. Now, another informal policy, if you will, or informal strategy, what's called mentoring relationships. Now, a mentor is an experienced person who helps guide the development of a less experienced person. Women and minorities are less likely to have mentors than white men, meaning that they're, for example, when you look at the space program, for many, many years, it was just men, white men, going up to space. But then we started to see more female astronauts, and then that gave, if you will, a role model, mentoring sort of relationship for women to see that women could also do it, and they could see women who were doing it. Now, reasons for lower number of mentors for minorities and women can include fewer women and minorities work in senior positions, so there's fewer of them to be available, like in astronauts, which results in less opportunity for new female and or minority employees to be mentored. Men are sometimes reluctant to be a mentor to a young woman for fear of gossip about sexual relations. They may assume women are less serious about their careers or that they feel less comfortable with women than they do with men. Some women have found that their own networks to compensate to provide women with support and a sense of belonging with other professionals. Now, we find that happens here in Owen Sound. There are networks of professional women who do meet on a regular basis and have similar gatherings that some men do, like monthly gatherings at a restaurant for coffee, and they do networking and sharing ideas and having speakers. Now, another challenge is workplace bullying, which is repeatedly acting towards another person in a way that is that humiliates, intimidates, or undermines that person's credibility. And I'm sure you're aware of the role and the influence of bullying, not just within the workplace, certainly within schools, online. Bullying is a huge issue that involves masculine and feminine communication speech communities. Women and gender nonconforming workers are more frequently the target of bullying by both men and women. Men bully men and women fairly equally, which I guess is kind of reasonable, but it's not, of course. I'm being facetious. Women tend to be more frequently bully other women. This could possibly be explained by the early socialization of girls to evaluate and critique other girls. Now, I made reference to these two phenomena. One is called the glass ceiling, and the other is called glass walls. Now, the glass ceiling, this is an invisible barrier that limits the advancement of women and minorities. This most often results from subtle discrimination. Now, it's invisible. It just means that women don't seem to get into the upper level of management and ownership and leadership. There's not a reason. They could be very qualified, and you may even see even less qualified men get into those positions. And that's the glass ceiling. The glass wall is a metaphor for sex segregation on the job, in which women are placed in positions that require traditionally feminine skills: the assistant, clerical, counseling, human relations. Now, these jobs typically do not include opportunities for advancement. So, what gets done about some of these policies? And this is where I'm going to stick with just the U.S. content that's in their textbook. Now, efforts to readdress gendered inequality in institutions. One, equal opportunity laws. There's two main equal opportunity laws that have been passed since Brown, and they are Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that was in 1964, which prohibits discrimination in employment. Title IX in 1972, which prohibits discrimination in educational settings, that receive federal aid. And we saw that when we looked at education in that chapter, and they touched on that quite a bit. Several other opportunities, or equal opportunities laws, have been passed as well. The most recent, which was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Play Act of 2009. Now, equal opportunity laws focus on discrimination against individuals, not against groups. Complaints must claim a particular person has suffered discrimination, and focus on present practices. Now, the recent EEOC rulings have extended protections against sex discrimination to workers based on gender identity and sexual orientation, but these protections vary from state to state. I should comment, if you keep track of what's going on in the news lately, you may have been hearing that some of these affirmative action strategies are being are attempted to being retracted by the current administration in the United States. So none of these rulings are stayed and set. They can be altered. Now, affirmative action grew from the need to address the weight of historical prejudice. It is based on three key ideas. One, historical patterns of discrimination have affected groups of people, so remedies must apply to groups, not just individuals. Two, to compensate for the legacy of discrimination, there must be preferential treatment to qualified members of groups that have suffered discrimination. And then three, the effectiveness of remedies is judged by results, not just by the intent. And that's an important feature, but it's also difficult to manage in such a large country as the United States with so many people. Now, affirmative action has two important limitations. One, affirmative action recognizes the limited availability of qualified people from historically unrepresented groups. Fewer women and minorities have been educated and experienced to be qualified. And two, affirmative action does not encourage admitting, hiring, or promoting women and minorities that are not qualified. Qualified means that the applicants meet requirements, but they are not necessarily the best qualified. And so that certainly limits affirmative action. Now, a second form of strategy to reduce inequities in the workplace are what's known as quotas. And again, this happens in the United States. A quota specifies a number or a percentage of some group that must be admitted, hired, or promoted. Now, this can mean that if there's not enough qualified people to meet the quota, unqualified people must be promoted. And then there's also these things what they call goals. Goals consist of institutions' stated intention to achieve representation of minorities or women. There are no penalties for failing to meet the goals. So goals and quotas may work against women and minorities in the long run, not actually work for them. The quota or goal is seen as a maximum rather than a minimum number of women and minorities who will be admitted, hired, or promoted. Now, other institution institutional members may assume that they got in only because of their sex or race. Thus, women and minorities may be perceived as underqualified regardless of their qualifications. And then lastly, and this is something that occurs in Canada as well, we just do it a little differently, and that is diversity training. Diversity training aims to increase awareness of and respect for differences that arise from distinct standpoints. It is often implemented in combination with other remedies listed above, and you'll find those in your textbook there. A limitation of diversity training is that it requires a strong personal commitment from participants. Many people are unwilling to make changes, especially those that reduce their own privilege. And so that last point is sort of related to not everyone thinks they should, and if they're not feeling they need to, they may be asked to do it anyway, in which case you can't force somebody to accept somebody else, especially if they think they're going to lose something by accepting a minority or woman. I'm going to lose some of my power or my influence and give it to them. And that's a fallacy, because you never had that in the first place. It's just perceived. I hope this has been helpful. Good luck. We're getting near the end. Keep up the good fight. Bye now.